Story: The Unraveling of the Crimson Thread. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Himalayan foothills, casting long, bruised shadows across the dusty path leading to the outskirts of Shravasti. A woman named Maya stood motionless by the edge of a stagnant pond, her eyes fixed on the murky reflection of a moon that had not yet fully appeared in the indigo sky. Within the narrow confines of her chest, the weight of her lost infant felt like a cold stone that had replaced her heart, an immovable presence that defied the natural rhythm of her breath and the warmth of the evening air. She watched the surface of the water, observing how a single withered leaf falling from a gnarled pipal tree created concentric circles that expanded, thinned, and eventually vanished into the absolute stillness of the pool. Her mind, however, refused to allow the ripples of her grief to dissipate in a similar fashion. It reached out with invisible, desperate fingers, trying to grasp the vanished circles, attempting to reconstruct the leaf as it was before the descent into the water. In the distance, the silhouette of the Buddha moved with a slow, deliberate grace through the flickering shadows of the Jetavana grove, his footsteps making no sound on the dry earth. He did not approach her with words of hollow consolation or metaphysical promises of a future reunion. Instead, he simply existed in the same temporal space, his presence acting as a silent mirror to the cooling air and the darkening forest. Maya perceived the movement of his saffron robes as a slow wave of fire in the twilight, yet it brought no immediate warmth to her frozen internal landscape. She began to analyze the structure of her agony, noticing how the mind created a bridge between the memory of a warm, breathing body and the current reality of a silent, empty cradle. This bridge was built of the fragile fabric of mine, a persistent weaving of ownership that sought to freeze a moment in time against the relentless current of the universal river. The dissolution of her child's life was not a singular event buried in the past, but a continuous process that her consciousness fought at every pulse of her blood. She saw the Buddha sit beneath a tree, his posture an embodiment of the mountain that accepts the monsoon rain without seeking to hold a single drop. Her gaze returned to the pond, and she realized that the water did not mourn the leaf, nor did it identify itself as the possessor of the reflection. As the night deepened, the internal chatter of her sorrow began to lose its narrative structure, revealing the raw machinery of attachment underneath. The I that suffered started to appear as a phantom, a collection of flickering thoughts desperately trying to maintain a cohesive story in a world made of shifting sand and wind. The pain remained as a physical sensation, but the ownership of the pain began to fray like a worn hempen rope under tension. She saw that her grief was a monument built to a ghost, a complex architecture of longing designed to deny the simple, pervasive truth of change. The stillness of the Buddha served as a catalyst for this internal structural collapse, exposing the void where she had once placed her identity as a mother. Without a single syllable being exchanged, the rigid boundary between herself and the vastness of her loss began to blur into the night. She was no longer a person holding a memory, but a consciousness observing the flow of existence, where the appearance and disappearance of forms were but brief shadows on the unmoving ground of awareness. The heaviness in her chest did not vanish into nothingness, but it lost its density, becoming as transparent as the mist rising from the river at the first light of dawn. The world remained in a state of flux, but the desperate need for it to be permanent had started to wither like a lotus in the midday heat. She understood that the crimson thread of her love was not severed, but had simply become part of the larger tapestry of the universe, where nothing is ever truly lost because nothing was ever truly owned. The silence of the forest became a sanctuary, and the movement of the stars above echoed the rhythm of her own expanding heart. Story: the architecture of the silent ruin. High upon the Vulture Peak near the city of Rajgir, a former nobleman named Kavi sat amidst the crumbling red stones of a forgotten watchtower. The heat of the Indian summer shimmered off the valley floor, creating a mirage of water where there was only scorched earth and dry scrub. Kavi had once walked through halls of polished marble and commanded the labor of 1,000 men, but a sudden shift in the political tides of the kingdom had stripped him of his titles, his wealth, and the family that defined his place in the world. He looked at his hands, which were now calloused and stained with the dust of the road, and felt a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. His mind constantly attempted to inhabit a palace that no longer existed, reaching for phantoms of authority and the warmth of silken robes that had long since been burned or stolen. Below him, in the shade of a massive granite boulder, the Buddha sat in meditation, his breath a slow and steady tide that seemed to anchor the entire mountain. Kavi observed the awakened one and felt a sharp, critical curiosity about how a man could possess nothing and yet appear more substantial than the kings he once served. He began to dissect the nature of his own suffering, realizing that his pain was not caused by the absence of his riches, but by the persistence of the nobleman within his own thoughts. The mind was a relentless architect, constantly rebuilding the walls of a lost identity using the debris of memory and the mortar of regret. Every time the wind whistled through the ruins of the watchtower, Kavi heard the echoes of his fallen house, a sound that his consciousness amplified until it drowned out the present moment. He noticed that the stone he sat upon did not care for its history, whether it was part of a throne or a humble path. The vacuity of his current status was only a tragedy because he compared it to a mental image of a glorious past. As he watched the Buddha, he saw that the sage did not occupy a role or a title, but inhabited the vastness of the space between things. Kavi began to experiment with letting go of the narrative of his downfall, treating each memory of his lost children and his vanished power as a cloud passing over the peak. He saw that the clouds did not leave a mark on the sky, and the sky did not feel diminished when the clouds dissolved into rain. The internal transformation was not a sudden burst of light, but a slow, steady erosion of the false self. He perceived the movement of his own breath as a temporary guest in a body that was itself a collection of borrowed elements. The grief for his family began to shift from a jagged spear to a deep, quiet pool of understanding about the shared nature of all temporary forms. He realized that the love he had felt was real, but the person he thought he was while loving them was a construct of social mirrors and cultural expectations. Without the mirrors, the reflection vanished, leaving only the observer and the observed. The Buddha rose from his seat and walked toward the edge of the cliff, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its final descent. Kavi followed the movement with his eyes, no longer feeling the need to be acknowledged or seen by the master. The architecture of his silent ruin was finally becoming a window rather than a prison. He understood that the loss of his kingdom was the gain of the world, for in the absence of his things, he could finally see all things as they truly were. The phantom limbs of his power finally ceased to ache, and he felt the immense weight of his former life fall away into the darkening valley. He was no longer a man who had lost everything, but a man who had finally found the space to breathe without the burden of being someone important. The red stones of the watchtower felt warm beneath his hands, a simple and direct reality that required no justification or history. As the first stars appeared over the Vulture Peak, he closed his eyes and merged with the profound and necessary silence of the mountain. Story: The Loom of the Unfinished Shroud. The air in the valley of Magadha was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the rhythmic, mechanical thud of a wooden shuttle moving back and forth across a loom. Bharata, a man whose hair had turned the color of river mist, sat in the dim light of his small hut, his fingers moving with a precision that was born of 40 years of labor and a mind that sought refuge in the predictable geometry of silk. He was weaving a shroud for the wife he had buried beneath the peepal tree only 3 days prior. Yet in his internal landscape, she was still present in every tension of the thread and every alignment of the warp. The mind of Bharata was a complex machine of reconstruction, constantly attempting to bridge the impossible gap between the memory of her warm breath and the chilling reality of the empty stool beside him. He noticed how his consciousness projected her image onto the shifting shadows of the wall, a phantom created by the desperate need for continuity in a world that offered only fragmentation. Outside his door, the Buddha sat under a cluster of bamboo, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling dust of the village. Bharata watched a single spider weaving a web between 2 bamboo stalks, observing how the creature did not pause when a sudden gust of wind tore a section of its intricate work. The spider did not mourn the lost pattern, nor did it attempt to recreate the exact lines that had existed moments before. It simply continued to produce the silk from within itself, responding to the new reality with a direct and unclouded action. In contrast, Bharata felt the weight of his own mental architecture, a vast and heavy palace built of what was that crushed the simple truth of what is. The attachment he felt was not to the woman herself, but to the role he played in her presence, a role that had now been rendered obsolete by the natural law of decay. He began to examine the very nature of the thread he held, realizing that it was composed of countless tiny fibers that were themselves in a state of slow, invisible disintegration. The shroud was not a solid object, but a temporary arrangement of fleeting elements, much like the body it was intended to cover. As his fingers moved, he started to observe the gaps between the threads, the emptiness that allowed the pattern to exist in the first place. He saw that the mind was like the loom, an instrument designed to create form out of the formless, but it had become trapped in its own creations. The grief he experienced was the friction between the moving river of time and the static image he held in his awareness. Slowly, the rhythm of his weaving began to sync with the steady breath of the Buddha outside, and the urgency to finish the shroud began to dissolve. He realized that there was no finished pattern in the universe, only a continuous weaving and unweaving of energy and light. The memory of his wife was not a burden to be carried, but a fragrance that had already been released into the air, impossible to hold, yet impossible to truly lose. His mind stopped reaching for the ghost and began to rest in the movement of the shuttle, finding a profound peace in the realization that the weaver and the web were both made of the same transient starlight. The shroud was no longer a monument to death, but a celebration of the capacity to change and the courage to remain empty in the face of the infinite. He understood that to live was to be a channel for the flow of existence, and to die was simply to return to the source of the flow. The shuttle moved one last time, and Bharata let the thread fall, looking out at the sunset with eyes that no longer sought to freeze the light. Story: The Gardener of the Decaying Lotus. Within the high stone walls of a royal garden in Vaishali, a man named Kasyapa spent his days tending to a pond of rare blue lotuses that were the pride of the kingdom. He knew the exact moment each flower would break the surface of the water, and he had spent years obsessively refining the mineral content of the mud to ensure their petals were of a uniform, celestial hue. To Kasyapa, the garden was not merely a collection of plants, but a physical manifestation of his own internal order and the stability of his identity as a master horticulturist. However, a sudden and violent monsoon storm had swept through the valley during the night, and as the gray light of dawn broke over the horizon, he stood before a scene of absolute devastation. The delicate lotuses were shredded and buried in a thick layer of gray silt, and the pristine pond had become a churning cauldron of debris and uprooted reeds. His mind recoiled from the sight, experiencing a visceral sense of violation as if the storm had torn through his own flesh. He began to frantically dig into the mud with his bare hands, trying to find a single intact flower, his consciousness locked in a desperate struggle to revert the world to the state it had occupied only 12 hours before. In the shadow of a nearby pavilion, the Buddha walked slowly along the debris-strewn path, his gaze neutral and inclusive, taking in the destruction with the same equanimity he might offer a blooming meadow. Kasyapa paused in his digging, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked up at the silent figure in the saffron robe. He noticed that the Buddha did not look at the ruined garden with pity or regret, but with a profound recognition of the inherent nature of all composite things to return to their constituent parts. Kasyapa began to analyze the structure of his own despair, seeing how he had built a mental cage out of the beauty of the lotuses, convincing himself that their permanence was a measure of his own worth. The substance of his life had become intertwined with the fragility of the petals, and now that the petals were gone, he felt as though he were dissolving into the mud. He realized that the storm was not an enemy of the garden, but a necessary part of the cycle that allowed for new growth and the redistribution of life-giving water. The mind's resistance to this cycle was the only true catastrophe in the scene. He watched a drop of rainwater slide off a broken leaf and merge with the pond, realizing that the water did not lose its identity by joining the whole, nor did the leaf suffer for having fulfilled its function. The internal transformation began as he stopped trying to fix the garden and started to simply observe the movement of the silt and the smell of the rain-drenched earth. He saw that the beauty he had cherished was never in the lotuses themselves, but in the awareness that perceived them, an awareness that remained untouched by the wind and the rain. The loss of the flowers was merely a change in the form of his meditation, a shifting from the celebration of order to the understanding of chaos. As he sat by the edge of the murky water, the boundary between his self and the garden began to soften, and he felt the immense relief of letting go of the burden of control. He understood that he was not the master of the lotuses, but a participant in a vast and beginningless dance of appearance and disappearance. The mud beneath his fingernails was no longer a sign of failure, but the very womb from which future beauty would arise when the conditions were right. The Buddha continued his walk, and Kasyapa felt a deep sense of gratitude for the storm that had shattered his illusions. He stood up, no longer a gardener who had lost his treasures, but a man who had found the unchanging ground of his own being amidst the wreckage of the world. The silence of the garden was now filled with the profound wisdom of impermanence, a song that needed no flowers to be heard. Story, the echo of the silent bell. In the dense, humid forests near the city of Kashi, a man named Siddhartha, not the teacher, but a humble bellcaster, spent his final years in a state of quiet agitation. He had dedicated his entire existence to the creation of sound, believing that the resonance of a bronze bell could capture the very essence of the divine and hold it suspended in the air for all to hear. However, a gradual and relentless deafness had begun to settle over him, turning the world into a muted, underwater landscape where the vibrant songs of the forest were reduced to mere vibrations in his chest. His mind became a frantic archive, constantly replaying the sounds of the past in an attempt to deny the encroaching silence. He would strike his finest bell and watch the metal shudder, his consciousness projecting the remembered tone onto the visual movement, a desperate act of auditory hallucination designed to preserve his sense of self as a master of sound. The loss of his hearing was not just a physical decline, but a fundamental erosion of the reality he had constructed around his talent. One evening, the Buddha passed by his workshop and sat upon a weathered log, his posture conveying a stillness that seemed to encompass all possible sounds and all possible silences. The bellcaster watched the Buddha's lips remain unmoving, yet he felt a profound communication emanating from the sage's very presence. He began to realize that his suffering stemmed from the belief that sound was something out there that he had to capture and control. The mind had created a duality between the eye that listens and the sound that is heard. And now that the bridge of the senses was failing, the eye felt isolated and dying. The perception of silence was not a void, he saw, but the ground upon which all sound is born and to which it eventually returns. He noticed that even in his deafness, there was a pulse in the earth and a rhythm in his own blood that required no external ears to be known. The internal transformation occurred when he stopped reaching for the vanished echoes and began to listen with his entire being to the silence itself. He saw that the silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper, more fundamental reality that remained untouched by the coming and going of vibrations. His bells were no longer tools for capturing the divine, but pointers toward the infinite quietude that resided at the heart of all things. The panic in his mind subsided, replaced by a vast and inclusive awareness that welcomed the silence as a long-lost friend. He realized that the master of sound had been a temporary mask, and that the true observer was the silence itself, watching the world with an unblinking and compassionate eye. As the stars began to flicker in the dark canopy above, the bellcaster felt the weight of his years and his lost craft dissolve into the cool night air. He was no longer a man losing his world, but the universe experiencing its own profound and necessary stillness. The silence was not an end, but a beginning, a wide-open gate through which he could finally walk without the burden of being anyone at all. Story: The Mirage of the Eternal City. Under the relentless glare of the midday sun in the kingdom of Kosala, an elderly scholar named Vasu wandered through the bustling marketplace of a thriving city. He had spent 5 decades cataloging the laws, the lineages, and the architectural marvels of the great urban centers of India, convinced that the collective achievements of humanity represented a permanent victory over the chaos of nature. To Vasu, the city was a fortress of meaning, a place where the passage of time was recorded in stone and ink rather than the fleeting seasons of the forest. However, he had recently received word that his home city had been leveled by an earthquake, and the library containing his life's work had been swallowed by the opening earth. His mind was currently a site of immense structural collapse, struggling to reconcile the image of the eternal city with the reality of the dust and the rubble. He looked at the vibrant crowds around him and saw not people, but walking ghosts inhabiting a temporary dream that would inevitably dissolve. The Buddha sat near the city gate, his back against a mud brick wall that was already beginning to flake and crumble under the heat. Vasu observed the teacher and felt a deep, philosophical resentment toward the ease with which the sage accepted the transience of all things. He began to investigate the mechanism of his own attachment, realizing that he had used the city as a proxy for his own ego, seeking a sense of immortality through the endurance of collective memory. The transience of his scrolls was a personal affront to the eye that sought to be remembered, a desperate clutching at shadows in a world made of light. He noticed how the mind constantly attempted to solidify the fluid movement of life, turning the river of experience into a series of static ice blocks that it could then count and categorize. As he watched the Buddha, he saw that the sage did not seek to build anything that would last, but lived in the perfect sufficiency of the dissolving moment. The internal transformation began as Vasu allowed the mental image of his lost library to finally crumble into the void. He saw that the wisdom he had sought was not in the words on the scrolls, but in the capacity to perceive the truth without the need for mediation. The city around him began to lose its appearance of solidity, becoming a shimmering dance of light and shadow that required no history to be beautiful. He realized that the earthquake had not destroyed his work, but had completed it, providing the final and most profound lesson in the nature of reality. The grief he had carried for his lost legacy began to evaporate like mist in the morning sun, leaving behind a clarity that was both sharp and incredibly light. He understood that to seek permanence in a world of change was like trying to draw a circle on the surface of a flowing stream. The peace he felt was not the peace of the grave, but the peace of the wind that moves freely because it has no shape to defend. The Buddha rose and walked out of the city gate, and Vasu followed with a step that felt effortless for the first time in years. He was no longer a scholar of the past, but a student of the eternal now, where every falling leaf and every crumbling stone was a perfect and complete teaching. The mirage of the eternal city had finally faded, revealing the vast and unconditioned horizon of the awakened mind.